understanding of God depends upon our understanding of ourself. If we believe and feel that we are a temporary, finite, separate self, then we will conceive of God in a way that is consistent with our belief in ourself as a separate person. So we think of ourself as a separate person, and God is something other than ourself. That is, God is personal with qualities, and that is the God of conventional Christianity, the God that is at an infinite distance from ourselves, and that we have to pray to or devote ourselves to. Such a God is a personal God, and we conceive of such a God in a way that is consistent with our belief in ourself as a personal self. So the deeper understanding of God depends upon our deeper understanding of ourself. If we realize that ourself, what we refer to as I or myself, is not really myself as a temporary, finite, separate being, but is itself infinite being, then God ceases to be at an infinite distance from ourself and is realized to be our very own self, the only self there is. So any sense of a personal self then disappears, and all that remains is infinite, unqualified being. And the human being is understood as a temporary limitation of God's being. God's being clothed, as it were, in human experience. So the being on the inside is God's being. The clothing, that is our experience, thinking, feeling, sensing, and perceiving, is what appears to limit God. Just as the four walls of this room appear to limit this space. But actually this space is not limited. If we were to take a sample of this space, it would be identical to the space outside this room. So likewise, if we take a sample of our being, just pure being, before it is qualified by experience, it has no objective qualities. Its nature, as we said earlier, is peace, joy. It is ever present, not everlasting in time, ever present now, infinite. So that would be a higher understanding of the word God. But both are legitimate.
And they essentially would correspond to sort of the direct path and the path of surrender, as Ramana would speak of them?
The path of surrender, what we consider to be the path of surrender, again, it evolves, or the path of devotion evolves with our understanding of ourself. So to begin with, if we feel I am a temporary, finite, separate self, then we devote ourselves to God, who we consider to be other than ourself and at a distance from ourself. And we devote ourselves to that God. And that is legitimate. In a way, it is the highest state of the individual. When I say the highest state, I mean the individual, it puts itself in the correct relationship to the whole, namely devotion to it, subservience to it. But when we understand that our being is not a personal being that is devoted to God, but our being is God's being, in fact there is no personal being, then our understanding of devotion and surrender takes on a completely new meaning. It is not the person that surrenders. It is the person that is surrendered. And that is why Ramana Maharshi said that the path of self-inquiry, the jnana yoga, the way of knowledge, is in fact identical to the path of bhakti or devotion. Because in the path of self-inquiry, we investigate the nature of ourself. We trace our way back to our essential being and remain there. In the path of, in the highest expression of the path of devotion, or bhakti. We completely surrender any sense of being an individual being, and we recognize our being as God's being. So they're exactly the same process. So in the lower stages of understanding, the path of knowledge, jnana yoga, and the path of devotion, bhakti yoga, are two different paths. But the deeper our understanding, the more they converge. And ultimately, they are the same path, which is the path that Ramana Maharshi spoke of. That's why he said the path of self-inquiry and the path of self-surrender are the same path. You're not surrendering your desires, you're surrendering yourself. Irrespective of your desire, you surrender yourself, not your desires, your interest, your separate will. It's yourself. It's the belief that you are a temporary, finite self. It's the complete dissolution of yourself as a temporary, finite, separate being. The recognition there is only being. The being in me is utterly intimate, at the same time impersonal and infinite.
I mean, I can see that for the second path, the other path, but
in the second stage of devotion, which is what I would suggest the earlier stage of devotion, there is the devotee and there is the beloved. That's the conventional path of devotion. In the ultimate form of devotion, there is not room for a devotee. Because to consider oneself a devotee is to set oneself up as a second self, separate from God's self. Now, if it is to set oneself up as a separate being, separate from God's being. Now, if our being is separate from God's being, then God's being cannot be infinite. Because my being is something different from God's being. And if God's being is not infinite, then God's being is not God's being. So to set oneself up as a separate self is blasphemy. So it is not blasphemous to say, I am God, although we should never say such a thing. What is really blasphemous is to say, I am a separate self. Because in doing so, without realizing it, we are denying the infinite nature of God's being by setting ourselves up as a finite being. So it is blasphemy to say or believe or feel, I am a separate self. It's what Rumi referred to when he said, in the existence of your love, I become non-existent. It's not that I love you. That's the early stage of devotion. I love God, I am surrendered to God. But as our devotion deepens, there is no room for an I, albeit a very loving, devoted I. In the existence of your love, I become non-existent. That's pure devotion, in which there is no devotee and no beloved. There is just God's infinite being. That's the height of devotion, and it's the same experience to which self-inquiry takes us. But self-inquiry goes through a more investigative path, whereas the path of devotion goes more through a feeling path, more through love.
Strengthen self-abidance, and how does one stay in that? And what tips and tricks would you recommend in making that happen?
Well, the way to strengthen self-abidance is by abiding in the self. And that's the only way. In the traditional progressive paths, the origin, the path, and the goal are different. We start here, we undertake a practice, we arrive at the goal. In the direct path, the origin, the path, and the goal are the same. He sent himself from himself, through himself, to himself. There is no intermediary or means other than him. So abiding in the self is where we start, it's what we do, and it's where we end.
on the point of will, there's a part of me which says that everything is perhaps the dance of consciousness. Then why should I deny something versus accept something? Why should I do more of something and less?
Only deny something if it in some ways violates understanding or love. If it is not consistent with understanding or love, then say no to it. If you see someone being cruel to an animal or unkind to a child, is that action an action that comes from the felt sense of our shared being? No, it is not. It is only possible to be cruel to an animal or unkind to a child if we feel that their being is something other than our being, and that what we do to them we do not do to ourselves. So, if you see an action like that, or if you, either in the world or in yourself, if you find something that violates understanding and love, then say no to it. And follow up that no with whatever action you feel moved to take. Because that is a no that, it is a no, a resistance in us that arises on behalf of truth, on behalf of love, on behalf of understanding.
Having a meditation practice is not necessarily always going back to the progressive path versus the direct path. It could also be, my question is, can it also be a help on the way to understanding the direct path?
To take up some practice from
to
the
have a
progressive...
regular meditation practice.
Sure. Yes. One might easily have a regular meditation practice on the direct path, but that practice, so the direct path doesn't imply that we don't have a regular practice. It just implies that that our practice is going directly to ourself, to the self, to the presence of awareness, which we could do for 20 minutes every morning with our eyes closed on the sofa before going to work, or coming back in the evening, or we might do it while walking down the street or in between emails at work. So it could be done in a formal setting at home, or it could be done in an informal setting walking down the street. But both would be, but the formal setting, setting aside time in the morning and the evening, would be completely consistent with the direct path. Or you may have some practice from the past, from your time on the indirect path, which would also be fine to practice that as a kind of preparation for just abiding in consciousness as consciousness.
Yes, in the Buddhist teachings, for example, the practice is always a means to go beyond, to go to the non-dual. When you go to the end of the Buddhist teaching, basically, this is non-duality. This is, you go beyond every kind of practice. The practice is just a human effort, I would say.
They're preparatory practices.
Yes,
and they are valid as such. Don't make a qualitative hierarchy between the direct path and the indirect path. There are two different approaches, but don't make a conflict between them. If you want to combine them, then it's fine. Use your practices from the progressive path as preparations for just abiding in the self as the self.
Just wanted to ask you about grace. Ultimately, whether it's the direct path or the indirect path, is our liberation or our clear seeing ultimately determined by grace. And in your view, what are the mechanics of grace? What is grace?
Okay, grace is the when King Lear is miserable, John Smith exerts a gravitational pull on him to come back to himself, to come back to the recognition, I am John Smith. King Lear experiences that as his search for happiness. So King Lear feels, I am seeking happiness. No, King Lear is not seeking happiness. There is no such person as King Lear, either to seek happiness or not to seek happiness. What is really happening is that John Smith has veiled himself with his own activity, and as a result appeared as John Smith, and he's now suffering as King Lear, and he's now suffering because of it. And so John Smith exerts a pull, a gravitational pull on King Lear to come back to himself. That's grace. So what King Lear experiences as the search for happiness is, from John Smith's point of view, grace. So we all think, I'm seeking happiness, I long for happiness, or I long for enlightenment. It's the same thing. We think that's what I'm doing as a person. No, that's the arrogance of us. That's the arrogance of the person, thinking, I am doing that, I am seeking happiness. No, God is reeling us in. We don't do anything. It's not even that we don't do anything. There is no separate we, either to do something or not to do something. It's all grace. But it's not grace or effort. Effort is just what grace feels like from a human point of view. What we feel it as effort. We as separate people feel, I am making an effort. Actually, God is reeling us in. So don't think of either grace or effort. Effort is just what grace looks like from a human perspective. So make all the effort you want to make. What actually is happening is that God is just longing to have you back. The more intense your effort, in reality, the more deeply God wants you home again. If I can be allowed to use the God word in this way. I guess in this house I'm safe using the God word so liberally. So just make whatever efforts you feel motivated to make them. And know in your heart that really it is God who's attracting you back home.
So, like for example, understanding, that would be a form of grace, I'm guessing, when there's a shift or an understanding of a teaching, or that would be, I guess, a form of grace.
Absolutely, because understanding understanding never takes place in the mind. That's understanding means that which stands under the mind. The mind is a process of thinking. Yes, for understanding to take place, the process of thinking must come to an end. Yeah, when a storyteller tells a joke, as long as they're telling the joke, our mind is active. We're thinking, where is he going with this one? And a good storyteller will eke out the story, and the storyteller is winding up the mind, winding up the sense of anticipation. We haven't understood, and then there's the punchline of the joke. When the joke comes to an end, the experience of understanding takes place. We understand the joke, but we can't understand the joke until the joke's ended. So the telling of the joke is the activity of the mind. It is an activity of thinking. But thinking has to come to an end for understanding to take place. The thinking takes place in the mind. Understanding is a revelation of that which precedes the mind. Understanding is the dissolution of the mind in its source of awareness. So understanding is the shining of awareness. It can be formulated by the mind, but it doesn't take place in the mind. Understanding, it's another name for truth, yes. I use the words truth and understanding synonymously, and I don't when I speak of truth or understanding, I don't mean a formulation in the mind. What we're doing here in our conversations is formulating understanding. Understanding can be formulated in thoughts. Happiness is the nature of being. We share our being with everyone and everything. These are formulations of understanding. They are not understanding itself. Mm-hmm. Understanding itself is formless. The mind has to come to an end before understanding can take place.
Hi Rupert, it's Mark here.
Hi Mark.
I want to ask you about your Zen master on his deathbed story. I've heard you mention that one a few times, and when you say that how are things for you now, he's asked, he says, things are fine, but my body is having a hard time keeping up. I understand when you've explained that before, as I understand your response is that he is having a hard time experiencing his body in the sense of pure awareness, something that is beyond the body. But I also wonder whether there isn't just the absolute truth that the body is finite and the body literally cannot keep up, because it's not designed to do that, because it is separate and it is dying and it is finite. So I just wonder if you could expand on that a bit, because I'm kind of thinking in that state of the body giving up, the body doing what the body ultimately will, how you would see the master tackling that in full awareness.
Well, there are two possible levels of understanding at which we could address this. If we credit the body with an existence of its own, made out of matter, then it is true that that body is temporary and disappears, and that the Zen master just lets that body disappear as it lets its body go like you let an old overcoat go. That would be the approach at that level of understanding. At a higher level of understanding, as expressed, for instance, in the Bhagavad Gita, when it says, that which is never ceases to be, and that which is not never comes into existence. At this level of understanding, we don't credit anything with its own independent existence. That which is not never comes into being. Only that which is never ceases to be. So from this point of view, there is only reality, infinite consciousness, God's infinite being, and that's not something that comes and goes. It continually changes its appearance, just like your TV screen continually changes its appearance, but when the person dies in the movie, its reality, relatively speaking, the screen, doesn't die. Its reality, the screen, just loses a temporary name and form. So from this point of view, there is no real appearance or disappearance of anything. The appearance and disappearance of things belongs to the illusion or the appearance of things. All illusions have a reality to them. The illusory landscape that the screen is the reality of the illusory landscape in the movie, relatively speaking. So this world is an illusion as a multiplicity and diversity of objects and selves made out of matter. That's an illusion, but all illusions have a reality to them. Illusion doesn't mean something is non-existent. It just means it's not what it appears to be. This world is not what it appears to be. Doesn't mean to say it's not real. It is real. We all feel that our experience in the world is real. Our experience is undeniably real. It's just not what it appears to be. What does it appear to be? A multiplicity and diversity of objects and selves. What is it really? The activity of infinite consciousness. And that infinite consciousness doesn't appear or disappear. It's not born, it doesn't die. So in reality, when you read some of the most sacred and profound scriptures, they say things like, there is no death, there is no birth. They're talking at a very high level. Reality is not something that is born or appears. It's not something that evolves. It's not something that disappears. It just eternally is. That which is never ceases to be. And that which is not, separate bodies, separate objects, never even comes into existence. It's just how reality appears from our localized perspectives. So these are two different views on the death of the body. They're both valid, and during the death process you might take both points of view.
I look forward to that. Yeah.
Look forward to it. One moment.
Thank you. I'll give it a try tonight. Thank you, Rupert.
Well, the way to strengthen self-abidance is by abiding in the self. And that's the only way. In the traditional progressive paths, the origin, the path, and the goal are different. We start here, we undertake a practice, we arrive at the goal. In the direct path, the origin, the path, and the goal are the same. He sent himself from himself, through himself, to himself. There is no intermediary or means other than him. So abiding in the self is where we start, it's what we do, and it's where we end.